Hello, welcome to CW News. I'm G. Antonelli.
And I'm Nick Thompson.
Today to start off the show, we're going to start with some breaking news from Dylan in Key West.
Hey guys, it's Dylan here in Key West, and I think we're screwed. We're all dead.
This just in, no missiles have been set off.
Any more details about the crisis, Dylan?
Yeah guys, all the info we have right now is that the Russians have missiles in Cuba and threatening to release them towards the United States. Once I get more, I will be back to you.
So, what kind of weapons do they have in Cuba? Back to you, Dylan.
Right now, all we know is they have nuclear missiles. Not sure about other weapons or anything like that. Once we get news on that, we'll come back to you.
Could you give us more info, like the history of the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Alright guys, so the history of the Cuban Missile Crisis is that in 1959, Fidel Castro came to power in Cuba and began a communist party. Within the next year, both Cuba and Russia became allies, which was an issue for the United States, which occurred to have the outcome of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Then in 1961, the Bay of Pigs happened in Cuba. Then in 1962, missiles in Turkey were discovered, which came to be owned by Cuba and Russia. Also in 1962, Soviet ships went to Cuba to blockade so no one could get in or out, which caused huge problems between the United States and Cuba. On October 26, 1962, where the US, Russia, and Cuba had a standoff with missiles. Then on October 28, 1962, the crisis finally came to an end when Khrushchev agrees to remove all the missiles from Cuba, which ended the Cuban Missile Crisis. After the crisis, the U.S. and Soviet Union created the Moscow-Washington Hotline, a direct communication link between Moscow and Washington. Purpose was to have a way that leaders of the two Cold War countries could communicate to solve such a crisis. To compromise and embarrass Khrushchev and the Soviet Union, the U.S. removed missiles from Italy and Turkey. That is the aftermath of the Soviet Union and the Cuban Missile Crisis. For Cuba, Castro was especially upset that Cuban issues such as the status of the U.S. naval base in Guantanamo were not addressed by Kennedy or Khrushchev. That situation caused Cuban and Soviet relations to deteriorate for years to come. But on top of that, Cuba continued to be protected from an invasion. That's the aftermath for Cuba and the Cuban Missile Crisis. For the U.S., General Curtis LeMay stated to the President that this was the greatest defeat in our history. U.S. citizens have been relieved that no impact was brought to them during the Cuban Missile Crisis. In popular culture, the American popular media, especially television, made heavy use of the events of the Missile Crisis in both fictional and documentary forms. Jim Willis includes the crisis as one of the top 100 media moments that changed America. Sheldon Stern finds that a half-century later, there are still many misconceptions, half-truths, and outright lies that have shaped media versions of what happened in the White House during those harrowing 2 weeks. According to William Cohn, television programs are typically the main source used by Americans to know about and interpret the past. The Soviet media proved somewhat disorganized as it was unable to generate a coherent popular history. Khrushchev lost power and was airbrushed out of the story. Cuban was no longer portrayed as a heroic David against the American Goliath. One contradiction that pervaded the Soviet media campaign was between the pacific rhetoric of the peace movement that emphasizes the horrors of nuclear war and militancy of the need to prepare Soviets for war against American aggression. For Cuba, Castro was especially upset that Cuban issues such as the status of the U.S. naval base in Guatemala.
Hello.
No.
Hello, and welcome to CW News.
We gotta wait.
Oh, I didn't have to wait.
Hey guys, I'm here in Key West, just waiting for the bomb, and yeah, I think we're screwed. We're all dead.
Oh my God. That's the line.
Yo, that is not the line, bro. We can't be using that.
That is
I think we're screwed, bro.
Bro, it's
How
just,
is that a-
we have to be funny with it.